Welcome to the second edition of Under the Radar, where I attempt to bring you stories that you may have missed during the week. So let's talk about fake news. From the New York Times, researchers created fake news. Here's what they found. So this study was done by two researchers, one from New York University and the other from Stanford. The paper's 40 pages long, and I'm not going to pretend I read it all. I skimmed it, and I'll leave a link if you want to read it for yourself. But I think the article sums it up nicely. There's some good news in that more people reported having heard and believed the true statements than the false statements. Only 15.3% of the population recalled seeing the fake news stories, and 7.9% recalled seeing them and believing them. The more interesting result, those numbers are nearly identical to the proportion who reported seeing and believing the placebos, the fake news stories. That is, the fake news stories invented by the researchers. In other words, as many people recalled seeing and believing fake news that had been published and distributed through social media as recalled seeing fake news that had never existed and was purely an invention of the researchers. That's a strong indication about what's going on with consumers of fake news. It may be less that false information from dubious news sources is shaping their view of the world. Rather, some people, about 8% of the adult population, are willing to believe anything that sounds plausible and fits their preconceptions about the heroes and villains in politics. And that's what it comes down to. If you're an ardent Trump or Clinton supporter, then you're more likely to believe fake news that supports that narrative than, say, a swing voter. So it's not changing votes of people sitting on the fence. It's just reinforcing the votes of those that have already decided. And that's not to say that fake news doesn't have an effect, just not the one that some people would have you believe. Now, staying on the theme of fake news, this next article appeared in the print edition of The Telegraph here in Australia. Soon legal to beat wife. Moscow. Russia's parliament is on the verge of decriminalising domestic violence in a bid to accommodate conservative voters. Lower house deputies have given initial approval to a bill eliminating criminal liability for domestic violence that stops short of serious bodily harm or rape. Well, this is obviously very alarming, although it did seem a little over the top. So I went looking for more information and found this, courtesy of the UK Telegraph. Of course, with the obligatory photo reminding us that domestic violence is always an angry man beating on a cowering woman. Controversial plans to partially decriminalise domestic violence in Russia took a step towards becoming law on Wednesday after Russian MPs approved a second reading of the legislation. The State Duma voted overwhelmingly in favour of a legal amendment that would end criminal liability for battery of family members that does not cause bodily harm and is not a repeat offence. Now contrast that with the wording in the Telegraph. They said serious bodily harm and didn't even mention that it was only for first offences. The bill would instead make domestic battery equivalent to minor assault, which is an administrative offence punishable by a 30,000 ruble fine, 15 days in jail, or 120 hours of community service. Now again, look at the Telegraph's headline. It's soon legal to beat your wife. That's obviously not true. It's still punishable by a fine, jail time, or community service, and that's only if it was a first offence and it didn't cause bodily harm. Ultra-conservative MPs and activists pushing the bill say the current law criminalises parents spanking their children but allows strangers to do so with impunity. Well, there's another important piece the Telegraph left out, and I wonder if ultra-conservative is just code for people with an opposing view to those on the left. Olga Badalina, pictured here sporting an obvious case of internalised misogyny, one of the bill's co-authors, rejected suggestions that the bill would grant impunity to abusive partners. The criminal code still carries criminal responsibility for battery, but now it will be applicable only for repeat offenders, she told state television. All those who terrorise their family members who do it repeatedly will face criminal responsibility. Now, I'm not suggesting that this law is good, bad, or otherwise. It should be evaluated after an appropriate period of time. The point here is to show the blatant dishonesty of mainstream news outlets in presenting this as something that it isn't. And for those that don't live in Australia, this is not a particularly left-leaning newspaper. They'll often print articles critical of feminism or political correctness from the likes of Mark Latham or Miranda Devine. But it is commensurate with the hysteria around domestic violence in Australia. Now, speaking of hysteria, this next story would have generated a whole lot more of it had the comments been made by a male. But they were made by one of Australia's leading female scientists. Feminized Physics, a formula for failure, says Michelle Simmons. One of the nation's leading scientists has attempts to feminize the high school physics curriculum by replacing maths formulas with essays as a disaster, which has left students unprepared for university. And our politicians wonder why our educational standards are slipping. Renowned quantum physicist Michelle Simmons used an Australia Day address in Sydney yesterday to warn against the dumbing down of high school science and urged authorities to set the bar high for students to encourage them to excel. Professor Simmons' criticism of the science curriculum has been supported by teaching experts who told The Australian yesterday that university physics courses were being altered to compensate for students leaving high school with limited math skills. One of the few things that horrified me when I arrived in Australia in 1999 was to discover that several years ago the high school physics curriculum was feminised, Professor Simmons told a high-profile audience at Sydney's Conservatorium of Music. In other words, to make it more appealing to girls, our curriculum's designers substituted formulae with essays. What a disaster, she said. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if a male, no matter what his scientific credentials, stood up and said that? Oh, Jesus! But the good news is, and the New South Wales Education Standards Authority will introduce a new science curriculum to take effect from next year, which will reintroduce a focus on maths and reverse the introduction of sociology and history into the discipline. Professor Simmons said there was a big cost in trying to make learning easier for students because when we reduce the quality of education that anyone receives, we reduce the expectations we have of them. If we want young people to be the best they can be at anything, we must set the bar high and tell them we expect them to jump over it, she said. My strong belief is that we need to be teaching all students, both girls and boys, to have high expectations of themselves. Why is it that common sense seems so rare when you hear it nowadays? But on to the opposite of common sense, which, surprise, surprise, comes from a feminist. Louise ONeill, it is impossible for women to be sexist towards men. Louise ONeill talks about the notion of reverse sexism and how it is impossible for women to be sexist towards men. Well, straight away I reject the term reverse sexism, the same way I reject the term reverse racism. Sexism is sexism, no matter which gender is perpetrating it. Now, Louise ONeill starts out arguing that she's not a man-hater, that she likes men. She's just criticising societal structures that benefits white, straight men at the cost of others. But the argument just comes down to the oppression Olympics, wrapped in the well-worn power plus prejudice canard. She cites Melissa A. Fabello, a self-described body acceptance activist, sexuality scholar, and patriarchy smasher living in Philadelphia. So in other words, she's an angry cat lady that's done a year of gender studies. Women can make stereotypical assumptions about men. They can be prejudiced towards men. They can discriminate against men based on those prejudices. However, she writes, only oppressed people experience all of that and institutionalize violence and systematic erasure. That's why it's not possible to be sexist against men. Well, I guess she's never heard of divorce courts or the child custody system, sentencing disparities between men and women, or the health system, which cares a great deal more about women than it does men. But I don't want to fall into the same trap of playing the oppression Olympics. Maybe we could just acknowledge that both sexes have advantages and disadvantages. All this amounts to is proof by assertion. I believe X because reasons. Now, I could have written the rest of this article myself. She talks about internalized misogyny, subconscious bias, and sprinkles in anecdotes of discrimination against women whilst ignoring all examples against men. She acknowledges male issues like suicide and then blames it on societal expectations of toxic masculinity. And of course, society's a patriarchy, so men's problems are their own fault. They just need to open up and be more like the women's. You could just regurgitate this stuff straight out of a first-year women's studies textbook. As I said before, the claim that women can't be sexist towards men is just an assertion, not supported by sound argument, and it's often used by those who expound it as a cover for their own bigotry.
And now for something completely different.
That's right, it's time for that non-controversial topic of climate change. Now, whatever side of the debate you come down on, when it comes to climate change, I think we can all agree that manufactured hysteria isn't helpful. From The Federalist, why the New York Times hid the numbers for the hottest year on record. So when you read an article proclaiming that for the third year in a row, last year was the hottest year on record, you might expect that right up front you'll get numbers, measurements, and a statistical margin of error. You know, science stuff, numbers, quantities, mathematics. And you would be wrong. I just got done combing through a New York Times report titled Earth Sets a Temperature Record for the Third Straight Year. The number of relevant numbers in this article is 0. We are not told what the average global temperature was, how much higher this is than last year's record or any previous records, or what the margin of error is supposed to be on those measurements. Instead, we get stuff like this. Marking another milestone for a changing planet, scientists reported on Wednesday that the Earth reached its highest temperature on record in 2016, trouncing a record set only a year earlier, which beat one set in 2014. It is the first time in the modern era of global warming data that temperatures have blown past the previous record 3 years in a row. Note to the New York Times, trouncing and blown past are phrases appropriate to sports reporting, not science reporting, except that no sports reporter would dare write an article in which he never bothers to give you the score of the big game. That's a nice analogy. Now he goes on for a bit about how difficult it is to actually find the relevant statistics, but here they are. This puts 2016 only nominally ahead of 2015 by just 0.01 degrees Celsius, within the 0.1 margin of error. So this could just be a statistical error, and he gives us another great analogy. To go back to sports reporting, that's like saying that the football is on the 10-yard line, give or take 100 yards. In other words, a completely useless statement to draw any precise conclusions. Now, this is not an argument to refute global warming, it's just an example of really bad reporting, sensationalizing a topic that doesn't benefit the actual debate. Now, since one of the themes of this episode is fake news, I think it's fitting to end with the man who has successfully mocked this narrative of the mainstream media.
This is a very different type of presidency, Nick, in that Donald Trump repeatedly referred to the United Kingdom Prime Minister Theresa May by her first name, multiple times calling her Theresa. And that was a little bit interesting because this certainly does signal that once again we are dealing with a very different president.
A very different president? You mean like Obama, who wouldn't dare use another head of state's first name?
Values that Angela just mentioned. The commitment that Angela and I share. Angela and I focused on the need for American and EU leadership. I commended Angela for her leadership, along with Angela and I also agreed. I want again to commend Angela.
So that's going to do it for this week's episode of Under the Radar. If you have any suggestions for next week, please leave them in the comments below. And as usual, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, or if you're feeling extra generous, consider supporting me on Patreon. See you next time.